Ghost in the Schoolyard by Eve L. Ewing, published 2018. Eve L. Ewing was an African-American teacher at the Chicago Public Schools. She is a writer and poet that works with children of color. The school she taught in Bronzeville, Chicago, was one of the 54 schools to be shut down. She was born and raised in Chicago. She resonates with Gwendolyn Brooks, who she quotes as, "will be remembered best as the Bard of Bronzeville." This book is about the closing of 54 schools in Chicago due to it being under-resourced and underutilized. But Ewing protests these ideas by stating that racism is behind it. In her book, she uses field observations, document analysis, review and transcripts, and interviews, like with Mayor Rahm Emanuel and the school chief Barbara Byrd Bennett. In the introduction, she breaks down different perspectives of the school closures. The supposed reasons of the schools being shut down is that they are not up to standards like the other schools. 90% of the schools subjected to closures were majority black, with 71% having mostly black teachers, almost unheard of in the American public school system, where 84% of the teachers are white. This led to the clear claims of racism and segregation of Chicago. Because of the students displaced, many of them ended up at even lower performing schools, which in turn brought those children down too. Those who got placed in higher performing schools saw minimal growth and had to travel a significant distance. Overall, school closings had a negative effect on students and parents. Barbara Byrd Bennett states, however, "What I cannot understand and will not accept is that the proposals I am offering," which the closing of the 54 schools is the proposal, "are racist." Chapter 1. What a School Means. Dyett Middle School was one of the schools to be shut down. Named after a music teacher who was known for helping his students learn through pursuing their interests in his case, music. His theories enabled many students to push themselves further and recognize their potential, not only creatively, but also in their education. This led to a school being named after him to recognize the dedication he had over the 20,000 students in the community itself. He was born in 1901 in Missouri, but moved to California where he graduated from high school and was first chair violinist at the University of California at Berkeley. He moved back to Chicago to continue his studies in medicine, but he gave up to pursue a career in music. He then became a music educator at a church, pushing him to pursue a career in education. This added to outrage because parents felt that the Black lives and histories was being taken from them. The Dyett School, like many other schools, was named after Black heroes in the community. The Dyett School was met with much protest and signified that Chicago Public Schools was not keeping their children in mind. They made proposals to moderate Dyett. They tried to attend board meetings, and they found that they were often scheduled for inconvenient times and were pushed back completely, canceled after many planned on going. They also tried to talk to board members themselves, but were almost often brushed off and given shiny, nice words that gave false hope. Chapter 2. City of Losses. The main idea of Chapter 2s were the roots of the problem that caused the schools to be shut down. We take a look at population increase, housing acts, so-called solutions and their consequences, and segregation's role. Many African Americans moved to the inner parts of Chicago in the Great Migration to seek job opportunities and escape Jim Crow laws in the South. This caused a high number of Black children in the Chicago public school systems. It's sad to say that segregation, because of the influx of African American populations, Chicago had a housing crisis where Black people would move to areas that were considered white. Chicago Housing Authority, CHS, was established to improve poor communities and provide federal support for a way to keep Black people in their own communities. CHS would later tear down these communities which misplaced Black students and their schools. This is a quote from the book. Additionally, those families who did return had to meet a variety of eligibility requirements to stay within the CHA system, from a mandate which they work 30 hours a week to provisions that they have adequate child care, maintain a good credit rating, and be subject to drug screenings and background checks. From 1990 to 1995, Bronzeville lost 272 children. From 1995 to 2000, it lost over 6,000. To accommodate the incoming Black students, the city of Chicago decided to build more schools with unrefined teachers and poor school sources. Furthermore, those newly built schools were confined to a small region of Chicago where the population outgrew it. There were other Chicago areas that had low rates in population but prohibited the excess of Black families to move there. Building more schools was about keeping Black students out of white schools. This is a quote from the book. At one point, Bronzeville held and packed within its narrow borders the astonishing figure of 16,000 children per square mile, over 4 times the density of children in the city overall. The consequences of building more schools. CHS remodeling housing that is meant to accommodate Black communities misplaced Black students and their families from school districts. This meant that the excess school built for the growing population was no longer needed. This would lead to the closing of 54 schools in Chicago. It's sad to say that segregation played a big part in the CPS system. Ben, the builder, ensured it. Instead of integrating the overutilized and over-resourced schools with the heavily Black populated schools, Chicago chose to build more schools to keep Black and white students separate. Wallace Benjamin, aka Ben the Builder, built 13 high schools to accommodate 10,000 Black students in Bronzeville instead of moving them to less densely populated white schools. The expansion and built schools that were meant to hold Black students only promoted segregation in the school system. In addition, when these schools were removed, it was the Black students that suffered. Their comfort and relationship with teachers became shattered when they had to move to a new school. It was the Black students that became devastated and had major setbacks in their own education. These are 2 quotes from the book. Rather than allow students to enroll in white schools, district officials created double shifts where Black students attended school for only part of the day, then traded off with another school. They hoped to maintain relationship with teachers they trusted. Parents scattered across the city by the demolition sometimes even sent their children to live with relatives back in their old neighborhood to keep them in the same schools. Chapter 3. Dueling Realities. Ewing discusses how racism, power, neoliberalism, and accountability are all mistrust that around 3 school closures brought to Bronzeville. Robert Byrd Bennett, head of CPS, says, "To refuse to challenge the quote, the status quo that is falling thousands of American students year after year, consigning them to a future with less opportunities than others. Now that is what I called racist." The disconnect of the Bronzeville family and the public schools were more than just efficiency and numbers described as having family ties and long histories with these schools. This is a statement to prevent the closing of Kay Sean School, Mayo School. My name is Kay Sean, and the reason I came here today is for the Mayo School not to close, because the school is like my home, and the teacher is like my mother, and the students like my brothers and sisters and my cousins. This is the reason I do not want Mayo School to close. Thank you. we are fighting the same fight. Chapter 4, Mourning. This chapter is broken down into institutional mourning and structural violence. Institutional mourning was felt by the African American community of Bronzeville with their school closings. Students and parents felt misplaced and angry because the closure prompted present racism. The closure cut out socialization for their children and therefore hindering their education. This was losing part of themselves that they saw in the school. This is a quote from Judith Butler that Ewing included in chapter 4. On the one hand, there is a loss of place and the loss of time, a loss that can't be recovered or recuperated, that leaves its enigmatic trace. And there is something else that one cannot get over and cannot work through, which is the deliberate act of violence against collectively humans who have been rendered anonymous for violence and whose death recapitulates an anonymity for memory. Institutional mourning can be described as the social and emotional experience undergone by individuals and communities facing the loss of a shared institution that they are affiliated with. This socially marginalized communities, and this was by the sociologist William Julius Wilson. Such segregation has contributed to what sociologist William Julius Wilson called social isolation. This is a quote from the book. Creating closed social networks that have limited overlap with the institutional of dominant white society. The second part of chapter 4 goes into structural violence. Many people believed that Emerson's closing had correlation with the 3 students' deaths that happened in the last 8 weeks of Emerson. There's a quote from the book. Create systems within which death and despair are quiet but inevitable, and the weapons at hand are history, policy, and racism. The school closings caused so much violence with protests and children being displaced in their schools that many students felt that they had no hope in their education, and many resulted in violence, and some resulted in death. The conclusion of the book. Eve L. Ewing finalized her thoughts on how the school closings were not of utilization but of racism, where the children were relocated and community members were discarded by those in power. There's a quote by Ewing. Is there room for democracy in a school system that is run by an oligarchy? She claims that schools' worth should not be measured just by underutilized it is from the perspective of the board, instead measured by what it brings to the community and those who are impacted if the schools were to close. Here we discuss the connections of the book to readings in class. This is the article by Valerie Strauss, Why We Should Diversify the Overwhelmingly White U.S. Teaching Force and How, and the connection with the ghost in the schoolyard. The article taught us how students are more comfortable and at ease when they have a teacher that looked like them. In this way, the students and teachers better understand each other because Chicago failed to integrate their schools. Black parents sought out to get refined Black teachers that can help their children grow. They felt having someone that understood them will encourage intellect and education. Having a diverse classroom breaks prejudices on the side of the teacher and students. There's a quote from Valerie Strauss. Studies indicate that tremendous benefits occur to African American and Hispanic Latino students who attend schools with high concentrations of African American or Hispanic Latino teachers. These students are less likely to be expelled or suspended, more likely to be recommended for gifted education, less likely to be misplaced in special education, and more likely to graduate high school in 4 years. Because the student and teacher understand each other, barriers are brought down, and the teachers are able to see who the children are without their skin being their first thought. Another article we take a look at from the reading in class is I Feel Invisible, Native Students Languish in Public Schools. The Native students in this article, while they are in the majority, are often pushed aside and discriminated against when compared to their white counterparts. Similarly, the students in Chicago School District, who are the majority in their area, are disregarded and seen more as liability than future members of society. They were also made promises that the board could not seem to keep. Broken promises, that's all you get from the school. As we see in I Feel Invisible, Native Students Languish in Public Schools, those students were met with death, violence, desperation, because the school system did not help them in any way. Similarly, the students in Chicago felt the same way by being displaced from their schools they grew up with. Questions and thoughts we had about the book. One of the questions is, during segregation times, were property taxes funding the public schools? In today's society, property taxes is the number one funding for schools. This is why more communities with higher incomes have better schools, and communities with lower incomes have lower funding for their schools. This, again, if property taxes led to the funding during segregation times, could be seen as why the white schools had so much resources and why the black schools didn't, and why they were so under-resourced and, quote, underutilized. Another question is, would politicians like Willis Benjamin still ration the idea of colorblindness when it came to race in today's society? Colorblindness is such an old term where people dodge the accusation of racism because they are colorblind. If you are colorblind, you are racist because you need to understand someone's skin color to understand them. You shouldn't look past their color to understand them. You should look what their skin color contributes to their identity. So would politicians today claim colorblindness because it is such an old term? How can interest convergence be seen in the closures of Chicago public schools? Thoughts we had on the book. It's sad that many people in charge of a diverse school environment use terms like colorblindness. It is almost like they are ignoring the identity of students. Understanding a student's identity is key to their education and their learning. This is, in fact, a very sad story for future teachers to see. Students were being misplaced by the school system that were supposed to be there to help them. Teachers who were taught to be so understanding, to accommodate to these teachers, to accommodate to these children, were not being heard and were not able to put their skills to use. I feel that in many ways, teachers felt that they had failed their students. And I can understand that because the Chicago public school systems did fail these black students.